The stench was so bad you wanted to smoke, even if you didn't. A mix of cheap swill they called whiskey here. Acrid tobacco smoke that made your eyes water, stale dampness rising from the basement. And something else, something subtly metallic, like someone had recently mopped the floor after a messy knife fight. The gnawed bone. The name said it all. This was my unofficial office, my hiring hall, my purgatory before the next trip down to hell. I sat at the farthest table, the one that always wobbled, slowly nursing the rot gut from a faceted glass. The liquid burned its way down, but at least it dulled the aching pain in my shoulder. A souvenir from a swamp creature in Louisiana a couple of weeks back. The light was dim, the bulbs overhead barely chasing away the gloom, leaving the corners in thick shadow. Figures stirred in those shadows, guys like me, or almost like me. Hunters. The kind who knew that rustling in the bushes wasn't always a hedgehog, and a howl at the moon wasn't just a dog's concert. The walls were hung with trophies in various states of preservation. A darkened skull with unnaturally long fangs the owner passed off as a chupacabra. A shriveled parchment-like mermaid's hand under glass. A murky jar with some kind of eye floating in formalin. The notice board was plastered with yellowed slips of paper. Specialist needed for gremlin removal, docs. Missing goat, distinguishing features, glows in the dark. Buying Thunderbird horn, top dollar. Standard routine. Behind the bar, wiping the sticky counter with a dirty rag, loomed Silas, a mountain of muscle with a face like a road map of old battles. The left side was pulled taut by a crimson scar, maybe a burn, maybe a claw mark from a beast that got less lucky than Silas. He rarely spoke, but he saw and heard everything. Our eyes met. He gave a barely perceptible nod my way, then glanced at a folder lying on the edge of the bar. A new job. I stood up, ignoring the protesting creak of the floorboards, and walked over. Silas silently slid the folder over. Cheap plastic, a few sheets inside. "Fresh one," he rasped, his voice like gravel under tires. "Fat paycheck, supposed to be clean work too." I snorted. There was no such thing as clean work in our line of business. Dust, grime, blood, guts, plenty of that. I opened the folder. Glossy photo of a young man with the polished face of an aristocrat and cold eyes, Alistair Vance. A newspaper clipping from a week ago. Headline: Tragic disappearance of heiress. Ilara Vance vanished in Blackwood Forest. Photo of a smiling girl with large, frightened eyes. Below that, the typed text of the order. Target: werewolf. Location: Blackwood Forest. Vicinity of the abandoned village of Oakhaven. Distinguishing features: large, aggressive, unnaturally light, almost silvery fur. Reward: a sum with so many zeros I counted twice. Condition: delivery of the head as proof. Heads were always popular with the rich. Trophies, symbols of power over what they feared. Blackwood. I raised an eyebrow. Not the most pleasant place. The forest had a bad reputation even among our kind. Old, dark, with a history of disappearances and strange occurrences. "That's why they're paying so much," Silas shrugged his massive shoulders. "Vance wants revenge. Says the creature tore his little sister to pieces." He paused, then added quieter, "Or maybe he just wants the head for his collection. These rich folks. Crazy." I closed the folder. The smell of big money overpowered even the bar's stench. My shoulders still ached, but the sum was too good to refuse. Werewolf, a classic. Dangerous, yes, but predictable. Silver, fire, a trusty old revolver. I nodded to Silas. "I'll take it. Where's the client?" "Tomorrow morning. His estate north of the city. Address is in the folder. Be punctual. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." I took the folder, tossed a couple of crumpled bills on the counter for the drink, and headed for the exit. The air outside felt almost fresh after the suffocating atmosphere of the gnawed bone. The night was dark, moonless, perfect for certain creatures. I shivered, pulled up the collar of my worn leather jacket, and walked towards my old pickup parked in the alley. Time to check my gear, stock up on silver bullets, and get some decent sleep. Tomorrow held a meeting with a grief-stricken aristocrat and a contract for a nightmare's head. The Vance estate greeted me with sterile silence and the smell of money, a blend of lemon polish, expensive cigars, and something subtly musty, like old books or old secrets. The huge, dark stone house stood amidst a perfectly manicured lawn, resembling a mausoleum. Not a speck of dust, not a stray leaf. The contrast with the gnawed bone was jarring. A butler with a face more impassive than the stone gargoyles on the roof led me through echoing corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors in gilded frames to the master's study. Alistair Vance was the spitting image of his photo. Expensive suit fit impeccably, hair perfectly styled, fingers adorned with rings. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, cluttered with papers only for show. None looked disturbed. When I entered, he looked up at me, cold blue eyes without the slightest hint of grief. He tried to feign sorrow, pressing his fingers to his temples, but the gesture felt fake, rehearsed. "Mr. Kane?" His voice was smooth, well-practiced. "Thank you for coming so quickly. This tragedy, it has devastated me." I nodded silently, offering no condolences. I could smell bullshit a mile away. It's a professional hazard. I sat in the offered armchair, upholstered in expensive leather, feeling like a wolf in sheep's clothing, or rather in a shepherd's hut where everything was too clean. "Your intermediary explained the situation," I said bluntly. "Werewolf, Blackwood, head." Vance flinched more convincingly this time. "Yes, that beast. It took the only family I had left, my Ilara." He picked up a photo in a silver frame from the desk. The same girl from the newspaper, smiling and alive. She was so young, so fragile. Loved walking near the woods, said there was a special atmosphere there. I warned her, but she wouldn't listen. That day we were walking together near the old village. It burst out of the thicket, huge, pale like a ghost. I couldn't do anything. It grabbed her and dragged her into the forest. I heard her scream. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Too theatrical. I waited for the performance to end. "Are you sure it was a werewolf?" "Absolutely." He snapped his head up, anger flashing in his eyes before quickly being replaced by grief. What else could it be? Such fury, such strength. Local legends say that creatures have always lurked in Blackwood, and that pale fur... It's unnatural. He handed me a folded map. Expensive paper, precise lines. Blackwood Forest, the estate, the abandoned village of Oakhaven with the chapel circled in red. The last time something similar was seen was there. It's its lair, I'm sure. Then he took a small velvet pouch from a drawer and pulled out a silver medallion on a thin chain. Delicate work, engraved with the letter E. This belonged to Ilara. Maybe its scent will help you track the monster. He held the medallion out to me. I took it. The silver was cold, heavy. It gave off a faint, barely perceptible scent of expensive perfume, something floral, light. But underneath there was something else. A faint, almost undetectable metallic, slightly musky odor. A smell I sometimes caught near ritual sites or cursed artifacts. I quickly tucked the medallion into the inner pocket of my jacket. "The reward, as agreed with Silas, is acceptable to you?" Vance asked, reverting to a businesslike tone. Perfectly. Good. I want the head. It's the only thing that will bring me any solace. Proof that the nightmare is over. His lips twisted into something resembling a smile, but his eyes remained cold as ice. There was no grief in them. Only impatience and something else. Satisfaction. I stood up. I'll let you know when the job is done. I have no doubt of your professionalism, Kane. Silas gave you the highest recommendations. He escorted me to the study door, putting his mask of the grieving brother back on. Stepping out of the estate into the bright sunlight, I blinked. Everything was too clean, too perfect, too fake. Vance's story sounded plausible, but something didn't add up. The feeling of wrongness left by the strange scent of the medallion and the client's cold eyes wouldn't leave me. But the contract was signed. The advance, a significant portion of the sum, which Vance had transferred to Silas beforehand, was already waiting for me. A job's a job. I got into the pickup, tossed the map onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. Next stop, Blackwood. A place where the truth, whatever it might be, hid in the darkness beneath ancient trees. The edge of Blackwood Forest was sharp, as if someone had drawn a line on the ground. On one side, fields, sun, the familiar world. On the other, a wall of dark green, almost black trees closing in over an old, rutted road leading deeper. As soon as my pickup crossed that invisible line, the air changed instantly. Thick, damp, smelling of decay, moss, and something else, wild and ancient. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, falling on the road in sparse, trembling patches. The silence here was peculiar. Not an absence of sound, but its suppression. Even the pickup's engine seemed quieter. I drove a couple more miles down the bumpy road until it finally turned into a barely visible track. Farther meant on foot. I killed the engine, and the silence crashed down on me with its full weight. Only the rustle of leaves somewhere high above, and the occasional snap of a dry twig under the paw of some unseen animal. I climbed out of the truck, stretched, working out the stiffness, the feeling of being watched, a slight chill on the back of my neck, standard for places like this. Blackwood didn't like visitors. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed, checked my equipment. My trusty Smith & Wesson revolver, modified for .44 Magnum silver bullets, 6 rounds in the cylinder, another dozen in the bandolier on my belt. Heavy hunting knife with silver inlay on the blade for close combat and the final touch. A few traps with reinforced springs and silver teeth, more for insurance than the main hunt for a werewolf. But in a forest like this, extra caution couldn't hurt. Powerful flashlight with regular and UV modes. First aid kit containing, besides the standard stuff, bandages soaked in silver solution and a small flask of aconite tincture wolfsbane. Bitter stuff, but sometimes helped deter less determined lycanthropes, or at least slow infection if you got bit. Plus Vance's map, compass, canteen of water, and some food. Standard kit for a stroll through a cursed forest. I slung the pack over my shoulders, adjusted the revolver in the holster on my thigh. The map showed Oak Haven was about 5 miles straight ahead. You don't walk straight in a forest like this. Meant 5 or 6 hours walk, if I was lucky enough not to run into trouble along the way. I took Ilara's medallion from my pocket. The floral scent had almost vanished, leaving only that strange, faint, metallic hint and something else. The smell of fear. I put it back. Using it as bait felt wrong, and besides, I didn't really believe in that stuff. A werewolf's sense of smell would lead it to me anyway if I made enough noise in its territory, or it would lead me to it. The trees here were ancient, gigantic, their gnarled branches intertwined overhead, creating the feeling of a dark, living tunnel. Underfoot, a thick layer of last year's leaves crunched, damp and slippery. The sun barely reached here. Eternal twilight reigned. The silence was oppressive but deceptive. I heard, or thought I heard, soft whispers on the wind that formed indistinct words. Rustlings in the undergrowth that stopped the moment I turned my head. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I walked cautiously, trying to step as quietly as possible, but still felt like a bull in a china shop amidst this primal silence. I wasn't looking for an early encounter with the local fauna. My target was the werewolf in Oakhaven. Everything else was an annoying distraction. But Blackwood seemed to have other ideas. The forest wasn't just old and dark, it was alive. And it was hungry. I felt it in every cell of my skin. Ahead lay not just miles of path, but trials this forest had prepared for its uninvited guest. I walked for about an hour, deeper into the forest. The gloom thickened. The trees grew even more ancient and grotesque, their trunks covered in a thick layer of green moss like shrouds. The silence was broken only by my breathing and the crunch of twigs underfoot. The feeling of being watched hadn't lessened. Instead, it felt like dozens of unseen eyes followed me from behind every trunk, from every shadow. I tried to ignore it, blaming nerves and Blackwood's grim reputation, but instincts honed by years of hunting screamed danger. It came suddenly. No rustle, no warning growl, just a sharp movement in the dense undergrowth to my right, and something low, spiky, and fast darted onto the path. A hodag. A nasty creature from local legends I'd only seen in bestiary pictures before. About the size of a large badger, but covered not in fur, but sharp dark green quills like a porcupine's, perfectly camouflaging it in the forest floor. Short, powerful legs with long claws, a flattened snout with a mouth full of small, sharp teeth, and eyes, small black beads burning with malice. The creature moved incredibly fast, lunging at my legs. I barely managed to jump aside, whipping out my revolver. The shot's roar shattered the forest silence. The bullet, a regular one, not silver waste of precious metal on small fry, hit the hodag in the side, tearing out a chunk of quills and flesh. The creature shrieked but didn't stop, spinning around and lunging again. Two more identical creatures burst from the bushes behind it. They moved coordinatedly, trying to flank me. I fired again, hitting the second hodag in the head. It twitched and fell still. The third was already close, leaping, aiming for my throat. I pistol whipped it hard, knocking it aside. The creature tumbled but immediately scrambled up. The first hodag, wounded but furious, attacked again, sinking its teeth into my calf, just above the boot. I felt a sharp pain as its teeth tore through the thick fabric of my pants and skin. Simultaneously, I felt a prick one of its quills stabbed into my leg. I roared in pain and anger, kicking the creature away with my free leg with all my might. The hodag flew back, hit a tree trunk, and went limp. The third, seeing the fate of its companions, hesitated for a moment, then darted back into the bushes and disappeared. I breathed heavily, adrenaline pounding in my ears. Lowered the revolver, checked my leg. Pant leg torn, blood seeping from the wound. Not deep, but nasty. And that quill. I carefully pulled it out. Sharp. About an inch long with a dark coating on the tip. Poison? Unlikely to be lethal. Or hodags would be a much bigger threat. Probably something causing irritation or fever. Need to treat the wound at the first opportunity. I reloaded the revolver, holstered it, examined the hodags' bodies. Nasty creatures. But something caught my attention. They had attacked from a specific direction and seemed to be trying not so much to kill me as to herd me. I studied the tracks, the broken twigs around. Yes, it looked like they were driving me deeper into the forest, towards Oakhaven. Coincidence? Or was someone using the local fauna like sheepdogs? The thought was unsettling. I forced myself to move on, limping on the injured leg. The pain was tolerable but constant. The forest around seemed to hold its breath after the short, fierce skirmish. But the silence wasn't calming. On the contrary, it felt ominous, watchful. I sensed this was just the beginning, a warm-up before the main event. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, though deep in Blackwood it was barely noticeable. The twilight simply grew thicker, colder, taking on a violet hue. The wound in my leg throbbed with a dull, pulsing ache, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on the path and the sounds of the forest. After the hodag skirmish, the woods had sunk back into their deceptive silence. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It had changed. Less aggressive, but more pervasive. And then I started seeing them. At first, just flickers at the edge of my vision, a dark patch that vanished the moment I turned my head. I chalked it up to fatigue and the play of light and shadow in the deepening gloom. But then they became more persistent. Shapeless, ragged blots of darkness, slightly darker than the surrounding shadows, slid between the trees, froze behind thick trunks, peeked out from behind boulders. They had no clear outlines, but moved with unnatural speed and silence. Night stalkers. Shadow people. Another local spooky tale turned reality. They didn't attack physically. Their weapon was fear. They played with my mind. I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible, but seeming to speak my name. Kane, drifted from somewhere to my left. I'd spin around. Nothing. Just shadows dancing on the bark of an old oak. A rustle behind me. I'd turn, drawing my knife emptiness. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. Paranoia is a hunter's worst enemy. It makes you make mistakes, waste ammo on ghosts, lose focus. I stopped, trying to get a grip. Took a deep breath of the damp, earthy air. Just shadows, Kane, just your imagination playing tricks, I told myself. But my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. One of the shadows darted very close, almost touching me with an icy chill. I recoiled, heart hammering in my chest. No, not imagination. They were real. I pulled the flashlight from my pack. Powerful, multiple modes. Switched to ultraviolet. Legends claimed shadow entities feared certain light spectrums. I aimed the beam where the shadow had just flickered, a sound like hissing or a silent, pained scream. The darkness in the beam seemed to boil, contort, and the shadow recoiled, dissolving into the regular gloom. I smirked, feeling a surge of confidence. So, there's a way to deal with you too. I moved on, keeping the flashlight ready, periodically sweeping suspicious clusters of shadows with the beam. The stalkers didn't disappear entirely, but now kept their distance, warily watching the column of unnatural purple light I carried before me. Their whispers grew quieter, less frequent, but their mere presence continued to grate on my nerves, creating an atmosphere of irrational terror. This was worse than open combat. The psychological attack was more draining than physical fatigue. The forest was using all its resources to break me before I even reached the main target. First teeth hodags, now fear stalkers. What next? I checked the map by flashlight. Oakhaven wasn't far now, maybe a mile or mile and a half, the chapel on the hill as a landmark. I quickened my pace as much as my injured leg allowed. I wanted to reach a defensible position as soon as possible, rather than wander through this hostile living forest feeling like a target for every creature crawling out of the dark. But even the thought of the abandoned village and the desecrated chapel brought no comfort. I felt it. The worst awaited me there under the shadow of the broken cross. The shadows danced around, escorting me deeper into Blackwood, into its darkest heart. The last mile to Oakhaven felt like an eternity. The forest grew increasingly overgrown, the path almost disappearing under fallen needles and rotting leaves. The night stalkers fell back as I neared the edge of the old settlement, as if entering the territory of another stronger entity they feared disturbing. But that didn't make it any easier. The air here was heavy, stagnant, with a distinct smell of decay and desolation, mixed with that same faint but recognizable musky animal scent, the scent of my prey. The first houses appeared suddenly, black silhouettes against the darkening sky. Lopsided log cabins with the empty sockets of broken windows, collapsed roofs, fences overgrown with moss and weeds. Wind howled through the abandoned streets, whistling in chimneys like a lament for the long-gone inhabitants. The silence here was absolute, dead. No birds, no insects, even the rustling leaves stopped. Only the creak of a rusty weather vane on the spire of the dilapidated chapel, visible on a low hill in the village center. It swung back and forth, making a monotonous, irritating sound like a moan. I walked down the main street, if you could call the weed-choked strip of land between the ruins that. The feeling was oppressive, like stepping into a place where time had stopped, leaving only decay and sorrow. I tried not to look into the dark voids of the windows. It felt like unseen eyes of former residents watched me. Legends about Oakhaven varied. Plague, curse. Looking at these ruins, any of them seemed believable. I found the werewolf's tracks quickly. Huge paw prints pressed deep into the damp earth, much larger than any wolf's. Broken porch boards on one house as if something big and heavy had crashed through. Deep claw marks on a mossy stone near an old well. No doubt about it, the beast had been here, and recently. The tracks led through the village, winding between ruined buildings, and climbed confidently up the slope towards the chapel. So Vance was right about the lair, or whoever gave him the information. I stopped at the foot of the hill, catching my breath and scanning the area. The chapel looked sinister. Stone walls blackened by time and weather. Part of the roof collapsed, exposing dark rafters. The single stained glass window above the entrance was smashed, jagged shards of colored glass resembling teeth in a gaping maw. A broken wooden cross listed on the spire next to the creaking weather vane. The place looked like a perfect monster's den. I checked my revolver, made sure the knife slid easily from its sheath. Flashlight at the ready. Night was falling, and soon the moon, though not full tonight, would rise over the forest. Prime time for a werewolf encounter. I took a deep breath, pushing away unwanted thoughts about Vance's fake grief and the medallion's strange scent. Focus on the task. Find the beast. Kill the beast. Take the head. Get paid. Simple. At least it should be simple. I started up the slope towards the chapel. Each step sent a jolt of pain through my injured leg. Dry twigs and small stones crunched underfoot. I moved slowly, cautiously, listening to the silence. The weather vane's creak seemed the only sound in this dead world. I reached the heavy iron-banded chapel door. It was ajar. A draft carrying the cold and that same animal scent, now strong, almost suffocating, drifted from the gap. I pushed the door. It opened with a groan, inviting me into the beast's sanctuary, into my target's domain. Inside the chapel, gloom and desolation reigned. The last rays of the setting sun pierced through the broken stained glass and holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled of damp, mold, mouse droppings, and, of course, the beast. The sharp, musky odor permeated everything. The floor was littered with broken pews, chunks of plaster, and bird droppings. The altar at the far end was overturned, the stone slab cracked, and what remained of the church vessels lay nearby, twisted and coated in something dark like dried blood. The place clearly served as a den. In a corner under the remains of the preacher's pulpit was a sort of nest, a pile of old rags, dry leaves, and bones. Small animal bones, rabbits, squirrels, maybe even foxes. The werewolf clearly wasn't starving. I walked deeper, shining my flashlight into the corners. Signs of struggle were everywhere. Deep scratches on the stone walls, chunks torn from the remnants of pews, several pale, almost silvery tufts of fur caught on the sharp edge of a broken font. The description matched. Vance hadn't lied about the fur. I approached the makeshift den. The animal smell was particularly strong here. I shone the light on the rags, common scraps, old burlap. But among them, I noticed something out of place. A piece of thin, expensive fabric. Silk? I carefully poked through the debris with the tip of my knife. Yes, it was a handkerchief. Small, woman's, pale blue silk, with an elegantly embroidered monogram on the edge, quote, E.V., quote, Elara Vance. The handkerchief was dirty, but not torn, as if simply dropped. A chill ran down my spine, unrelated to the draft blowing through the chapel. What was the missing girl's handkerchief doing in the den of the werewolf that supposedly killed her? A trophy? Unlikely for a beast. Or had she been here alive? The doubts that had started in Vance's study resurfaced. Something about this story was wrong. Very wrong. I crouched down, examining the floor around the den more closely. A thick layer of dust and dirt covered the stone slabs. There were prints of huge animal paws, that was clear. But next to them, almost erased, I discerned other tracks. Small, distinct prints of a bare human foot, female or adolescent. They were here near the den, near the tufts of fur and bones. The picture began to form, and I didn't like it at all. What if the beast and the girl were one and the same? What if Elara Vance wasn't the victim, but the werewolf herself? That would explain the light fur if she was blonde, the handkerchief in the den, and her brother's strange behavior. He hadn't hired me for revenge. He'd hired me to get rid of his werewolf sister, who perhaps threatened his inheritance or reputation, and he needed the head as irrefutable proof of her death. This version seemed far more logical than Vance's tearful story, and much more disgusting. I hadn't been hired to kill a monster, but a cursed girl, a victim of circumstance. The cynic in me wrestled with the remnants of something like a conscience. A job's a job, but it's one thing to kill a bloodthirsty beast, and quite another to be a blind instrument in someone else's dirty family feud. A distant howl echoed from outside. Long, mournful, but with distinct animal undertones. The moon was rising. The time had come. I quickly checked my traps, set near the entrance and under one of the broken windows. Steel jaws with silver teeth were armed and camouflaged. I chose a position behind a massive stone pillar that offered good cover and a view of the entrance and the altar area. The revolver felt heavy and familiar in my hand. I turned off the flashlight. The moonlight filtering through holes in the roof provided enough illumination. My heart beat steady, my breathing calm. Doubts had to be pushed aside. Whoever this werewolf was, cursed girl or just an abnormally pale monster, it was dangerous. And it was coming here. My job was to survive and complete the contract. I'd think about moral dilemmas later, if I lived. The creak of the entrance door grew louder and a dark, massive figure appeared in the opening. The hunt was on. The figure in the doorway froze for a moment, sniffing the air, Moonlight from the broken window outlined a massive silhouette. Huge, much larger than any wolf. It stood on its hind legs, slightly hunched, long forelimbs with terrifying claws nearly touching the floor. The head was wolf-like but distorted, with an unnaturally elongated snout and rows of sharp fangs gleaming in the darkness. And the fur, it really was light, almost silvery in the moonlight, just as Vance described. Its eyes burned with a yellow, inhuman fire, scanning the chapel's dark space. A werewolf, no doubt. It let out a low, vibrating growl that made the hair on my neck stand up and stepped inside. It moved with a terrifying mix of animal grace and brute force, each step a heavy thud of clawed paws on the stone floor. It had clearly caught my scent, the scent of an intruder in its lair. Its head turned slowly, yellow eyes piercing the shadows. I decided to act first, before it pinpointed my location. Stepping sharply from behind the pillar, I raised the revolver and fired. The shot roared, echoing under the chapel vaults, even drowning out the weather vane's creak. The .44 Magnum silver bullet hit the werewolf in the shoulder. An ear-splitting roar of pain and fury erupted. The creature staggered back, clutching its wounded shoulder, dark blood spraying from the wound. But the silver didn't stop it. It only enraged it. With a roar that made the remaining glass in the windows tremble, the werewolf charged me. I hadn't expected such speed from a creature this size. It crossed the distance between us in a couple of leaps. I barely dodged behind the pillar as a clawed paw struck the stone where my head had just been, sending sparks flying and leaving deep gouges. I fired again, almost point blank, aiming for the chest. The werewolf roared again but kept coming. It was incredibly resilient. Chaos erupted. I dodged, fired, used pillars and pew remnants as cover. The werewolf rampaged through the chapel, smashing everything in its path, trying to reach me with its claws and fangs. The air filled with dust, the smell of gunpowder, blood, and animal rage. One of its attacks found its mark. It swiped my arm, knocking the revolver from my grasp. The weapon flew aside, disappearing into the darkness. Bad. Very bad. I drew my knife. The silver blade gleamed dully in the moonlight. The werewolf, seeing me disarmed, paused for a second, as if savoring the moment, then lunged. I rolled aside and it crashed into one of the camouflage traps near the wall. A clang of metal and a furious shriek. The silver-toothed trap snapped shut on its hind leg. That bought me a few seconds. While the werewolf howled and struggled against the steel grip, I scrambled to find the revolver. Found it almost immediately under the wreckage of a pew. Grabbed the weapon, checked the cylinder, 3 rounds left. Meanwhile, the werewolf yanked its leg with monstrous strength. A sickening crunch of bone and the rip of tearing flesh, it tore itself free from the trap, leaving a piece of its paw and scraps of fur behind. Now it was not only enraged but seriously wounded, limping but no less dangerous for it. It turned towards me, ignoring the gruesome wound on its leg. Blood dripped onto the floor, eyes burning with pure hatred. It charged again, heedless of the pain. I raised the revolver, aiming carefully, knowing I had few chances left. Fired once, twice. One bullet hit its side, the second the wounded shoulder again. It stumbled but kept coming. Last round. I waited until it was almost on top of me, raised the revolver and fired into its chest, aiming for the heart. The werewolf stumbled, froze. A sound escaped its jaws, not a roar but more of a ragged groan. It looked at me, and for a split second something sentient flashed in its yellow eyes. Then it collapsed onto the stone floor with a heavy thud. I stood, breathing hard, adrenaline still pounding in my temples. The arm it hit burned, the hodag wound on my leg had reopened. But I was alive. The creature lay motionless at my feet. Contract almost complete. Just the unpleasant part left. Taking the head, I approached, gripping the knife. Moonlight fell on the defeated beast, on its pale, silvery fur, now stained with blood and grime. I raised the knife over the downed beast's neck. The silver blade was ready to finish the job, to take the trophy my client craved. But just then, the werewolf made a soft, pitiful sound, like a wounded puppy's whimper. I froze. Its body convulsed. The yellow eyes, which moments ago burned with animal fury, now looked at me with understanding and horror. And then it began. It was hideous and unnatural. The fur rapidly retracted beneath the skin, revealing pale flesh covered in bruises and bleeding wounds. Bones cracked, breaking and reshaping with a sickening, wet crunch. The snout shortened, stretching into human features distorted by a grimace of unbearable pain. Long claws retracted, fingers spasmed, then straightened. In maybe half a minute, the huge monster's body shrank, went limp, and on the cold stone floor of the chapel, in a pool of her own blood, lay a naked, wounded young woman. Her pale hair, as silvery as the beast's fur, was tangled, stuck to her face and shoulders. Her eyes were closed. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths. It was her, Ilara Vance. The girl from the photo, the girl whose handkerchief I found in the den. My worst suspicions confirmed. I stood over her, knife still in hand, meant for her decapitation, and felt nausea rise in my throat. Not from the sight of blood and wounds. I was used to that. From the realization of what I'd almost done, and what I'd been hired to do. Ilara groaned and opened her eyes. The large, frightened eyes from the photo now filled with pain, fear, and a strange clarity. She looked at me, then at her hands, at the wounds covering her body. Tears rolled down her cheeks, mixing with blood and dirt. He did this to me, she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. I lowered the knife, crouched beside her. Your brother? She nodded, sobbing convulsively. Alistair. He always envied me. The inheritance. Father loved me more. He found something. An old artifact, cursed. I think it was a hair comb, a family heirloom. He slipped it to me, said it was a gift. Her voice trembled with sobs and pain. At first I just felt sick. Then the moon came. I didn't remember anything. Woke up in the woods covered in blood, not mine. She gasped, telling her story. How Alistair, realizing what he'd done, or rather achieved his goal, faked her disappearance and death at the paws of a wild beast. How she, terrified of what she'd become, hid in the forest, trying to fight the curse, but losing control every full moon or during moments of intense stress or rage. Oakhaven and the chapel became her refuge, a place to wait out the transformation without harming anyone. At least, she hoped. He knew I was here, Ilara whispered, looking at me with desperation. He knew sooner or later someone like you would come for me. He wanted me killed, like an animal, so no one would ever find out. She reached a trembling, bloody hand towards me. Please don't kill me. I didn't want. I'm not a monster, not by choice. A flicker sparked in her eyes, not yellow, bestial, but human. A spark of burning hatred. I have to make him pay. For everything. For what he did to me. For turning me into this. She pleaded for her life, not for life itself. She seemed past caring about that, but for revenge. She wanted to get to Alistair, wanted to look him in the eye before. I looked at her, fragile, broken, bleeding, but with the fire of righteous anger in her eyes. Looked at my hands still gripping the knife and revolver, at the contract I'd taken, at the money promised for her head, the head of a victim whose despicable brother decided to eliminate using hired hands. Inside me, the hunter's cynicism warred with something else, a long-forgotten sense of justice, or at least disgust for people like Alistair Vance. The silence in the chapel was heavy. Only Ilara's ragged breathing and the creak of the rusty weather vane outside broke it. I looked at the girl lying at my feet and weighed the options. On one hand, the contract. Clear, precise, well-paid, head of a werewolf. Technically, she was the werewolf. A job's a job, and money doesn't stink, especially this much. Alistair Vance would pay, and I'd walk away, forget this story like I'd forgotten dozens of others. The cynical part of me, the part that allowed me to survive in this shit, argued exactly that. On the other hand, Ilara herself, maimed, cursed, betrayed by her own brother. The victim of a monstrous plot, and Alistair Vance, smug, deceitful scum who not only condemned his sister to agony but also hired me to cover his tracks in the bloodiest way possible. The thought of bringing him his victim's head made me sick. It was dirty, even by my standards. And then there was her request. Not for salvation, but for vengeance. Such righteous fire burned in her eyes, such a thirst for retribution, that it resonated even in my jaded soul. I'd seen many monsters, and often the worst ones walked on two legs and wore expensive suits. Alistair Vance was exactly that kind. "He has to pay," Ilara repeated, quieter but firmly. Her gaze was fixed on my face. I slowly stood up, sheathed the knife. The revolver stayed in my hand, but I lowered it. The decision came on its own, dictated not by logic or profit, but by some gut feeling, sharpened by disgust for Vance. "All right," I said hoarsely. "I'll take you to him." I looked at her wounds. The silver bullets had left deep, slow-healing burns on her skin, plus the trap wound on her leg. She was weak. "But first, we need to patch you up, and me too." I got out the first aid kit, treated my own wounds, scratches from the hodag and werewolf bruised arm. Then I tended to Ilara, cleaned the worst wounds with water from my canteen, applied bandages soaked in silver solution. That should help neutralize the effect of my bullets a bit. She winced in pain, but endured silently, only letting out an occasional quiet sob. As I bandaged her mangled leg, our eyes met. Hers held a mix of pain, fear, and hope, or just determination to see it through. "Do you have any clothes?" I asked, glancing at her naked, shivering body. She nodded weakly towards the den. "There, in the bundle. Something left from my past life." I found the bundle, a simple cotton dress and a rough cloak. Not exactly fresh, but better than nothing. Helped her get dressed. She moved with difficulty, leaning on the pillar. "We'll go tonight," I decided. "Less chance of running into anyone. And it'll be easier for you." I didn't specify whether I meant her wounds or her curse, but she understood. The journey out of Blackwood proved no less tense than the way in. Ilara limped badly, leaning on a makeshift staff I'd cut for her, and on my arm. We moved slowly, stopping to rest. The forest around us was silent. Even the shadows seemed to have retreated, sensing the strange alliance between the human and whatever lurked inside the girl. But tension hung heavy in the air. I saw Ilara clench her fists sometimes, saw the yellow flicker momentarily in her eyes, heard her struggle to suppress a low growl when the pain in her wounds became intense. She was a ticking time bomb, and I was leading her straight into her enemy's house. Our unholy alliance was fragile, based on a shared goal payback. I tried not to think about what would happen next. The main thing was to reach the Vance estate. We reached the edge of the Vance estate under the cover of pre-dawn twilight. The huge house loomed dark against the paling sky, lights on in a few windows. The silence and ostentatious tranquility of the place seemed even falser after the wild honesty of Blackwood. "Wait here in the shadow of the trees," I whispered to Ilara, seating her on a bench in an overgrown part of the garden near a side entrance. "Don't show yourself until I come out or call." She nodded, pulling the cloak tighter. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. The yellow glint in them was more noticeable in the moonlight, which was already yielding to dawn. She clenched and unclenched her fists. The beast within was close to the surface. I walked to the main entrance. The butler, the same stone-faced statue, opened the door, showing no surprise or interest. Apparently, he'd been warned of my possible return. He silently led me to the same study where I'd met Alistair Vance the day before. Vance was already awake. He sat at the desk, but this time wasn't pretending to work, instead drumming his fingers nervously on the polished surface. Seeing me, he jumped up, his face a mixture of impatient anticipation and anxiety. "Kane, you're back. Well, were you successful?" His voice was tight. I walked to the desk and dropped my pack onto it. Not the one with the advance money, but the one I'd carried into the woods, dirty, worn, with several dark bloodstains. Some mine, some the werewolf's. "Job's done," I said evenly, looking him straight in the eye. "The beast is dead." The relief on Vance's face was almost indecent. He broke into a self-satisfied grin. "Excellent. I knew I could rely on you. The head... Did you bring the head?" "It got badly damaged in the fight," I lied without blinking. "The beast was strong, fought to the last. Had to use drastic measures. Only fragments left, not a very presentable trophy. I hoped that would satisfy him. The main thing was confirmation of death." Vance frowned for a moment, clearly disappointed by the lack of his desired trophy, but then waved his hand. "Doesn't matter. The important thing is it's dead. My poor Ilara, always so weak, so defenseless. It's good her suffering is finally over. She's found peace now." He delivered this with such false sorrow and poorly concealed triumph that my fists itched. Just then, the study door burst open. Ilara stood on the threshold. The cloak had slipped from her shoulders, revealing the torn dress and bandages on her arms. Her face was contorted with fury, her eyes blazing with pure yellow fire. Hearing her brother's last words, seeing his smug face, she lost the last shred of control. Peace? Her voice was no longer human, but a low, snarling growl full of hatred. "You'll find peace, Alistair." Before my eyes and the eyes of the horror-stricken Vance, she began to transform. Faster this time, more furiously than in the chapel. Rage fueled the beast. Fur bristled on her body, bones cracked, her face elongated into a feral snout. In seconds, she wasn't the wounded, hunted creature from the chapel, but the embodiment of pure primal vengeance. Alistair Vance screamed, a thin, panicked sound. He tried to back away, knocking over his chair, but it was too late. Ilara Werewolf crossed the study in a single leap and fell upon him. The sound of tearing fabric, crunching bone, a short gurgling cry, and then silence. I stood motionless, watching the gruesome scene of retribution. It was quick, brutal, and just. In this world, concepts of justice had long blurred. Ilara stood over what remained of her brother, breathing heavily. Her pale fur was splattered with dark blood. She slowly turned her head towards me. The fury was gone from her yellow eyes. Only emptiness and infinite exhaustion remained. On the floor, near the overturned desk, lay a briefcase. The one Vance had apparently prepared for me. The reward. Blood dripped slowly from her muzzle onto the expensive Persian rug. Ilara stood over her brother's remains, breathing heavily, steam puffing from her jaws in the cool morning air filtering through the window, shattered in the struggle. The animal fury that had fueled her transformation and revenge was gone, leaving only devastation behind. She slowly turned her head towards me. Her yellow eyes looked through me as if seeing something distant and terrible. And then the reverse transformation began, slower than the rage of vengeance, but just as agonizing. Again, the cracking bones, the whimpers of pain, the retracting fur. She sank to her knees beside Alistair's corpse, and when the transformation ended, the girl was back. Naked, covered in her brother's fresh blood over her old wounds, trembling from the horror and pain she'd endured. She looked at her blood-stained hands, then at me. There was no triumph in her eyes, no relief. Only a bottomless abyss of despair and the understanding of what she had become. Vengeance was served, but the price was too high. The beast within hadn't gone anywhere. It was just lying low, sated. I won't be able to control this, Cain, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up at me, eyes full of tears and a terrible final weariness. Today it was him. Tomorrow, who will be next? Anyone who angers me? Anyone who's nearby at the wrong time? She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks on her grimy skin. I'll become what you were supposed to kill from the start. A monster. A real monster. She looked at the revolver in my hand, then back into my eyes. Her gaze was steady despite the tears. It held a plea, but not for life. For death. Do it, she said quietly, but clearly. Please, while I'm still me. While there's something left of me. Finish your contract. Grant me the peace he wished for me. But the real kind. I stood motionless, the revolver feeling incredibly heavy in my hand. The air in the room was thick with the stench of blood and death. Nearby lay the briefcase with the money, my payment. My blood money for a double job I hadn't asked for. Kill the beast. Kill the victim. Kill the avenger. Where does one end and the other begin? I looked at Ilara, at her tormented face, the desperation in her eyes. She was right. The beast inside her wouldn't disappear. The curse of lycanthropy rarely fades. She was doomed to a life of fear, to a struggle she would eventually lose, becoming a threat to others. Her request wasn't an act of weakness, but a final act of humanity, a desire to protect others from herself. With a heavy heart, I raised the revolver. Our eyes met one last time. There was pain in hers, but also gratitude. I wasn't sure. I just pulled the trigger. The shot sounded deafening in the silence of the luxurious study, echoing off the walls lined with portraits of the Vance family's noble ancestors. Ilara's body went limp and fell onto the carpet beside her brother's remains. Silence. Only my own heavy sigh broke it. I stood alone amidst the carnage, in a room full of blood, death, and shattered lives. Lowered the revolver, walked over to the briefcase lying on the floor, opened it, stacks of crisp bills, my reward, the price of 2 heads. I closed the briefcase. It felt heavy with money and with what stood behind it. I picked it up, slung my pack over my shoulder. Without looking back at the bodies of the scheming brother and the werewolf sister, I walked out of the study, through the echoing corridors, and left the Vance estate via the side door leading to the garden. The morning sun was just rising above the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues that clashed violently with the horror left behind me. I walked away, melting into the dawn shadows. The money in the briefcase was a satisfying weight on my shoulder, but my soul felt heavy as stone. I had fulfilled the contract twice over. I got my pay. But this hunt left a scar deeper than any hodag or werewolf claw could. A scar on what passes for a soul in guys like me. The cycle of hunting and survival continued. But the world of shadows and monsters felt a little darker today.